Okay, so think about this for a second. What if I told you that every single one of us comes with a massive, super detailed instruction manual? Today, we're diving into that manual, our genetic source code, the ultimate blueprint of life. We're going to find out what happens when that super intricate blueprint has tiny but totally life-altering errors. Let's get right into it.
Right, so that's the big question we're tackling today. Just imagine the complete set of instructions to build a person, all laid out in this huge, complex blueprint. Every cell in your body has a copy. But what happens when that blueprint has, well, a typo? What if a page gets copied twice, or a page goes missing altogether? Or what if it's something as small as just one single word being misspelled? So before we can find any errors, we've got to know what the blueprint is supposed to look like, right? Well, in genetics, that's called a karyotype. It's basically a picture, a complete snapshot of all our 23 pairs of chromosomes, all lined up nice and neat. It really is the master plan for a human being. This is our starting point.
All right, here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to get familiar with the blueprint itself. Then we'll look at what happens when there's an extra copy, then a missing piece, and then a super tiny misprinted instruction. And to wrap it all up, we'll compare how these different typos can lead to some very different outcomes.
Okay, let's dive into our first type of error. Imagine someone's at the copy machine for the blueprint, and a page gets stuck, so it accidentally prints an extra copy of page 21. That's essentially what we're talking about with trisomy 21, which you probably know by its more common name, Down syndrome.
So what's in the name trisomy 21? Well, tri, that's easy. It means 3. And somy is just talking about the chromosome. So instead of the 2 copies of chromosome 21 that most of us have, people with Down syndrome have 3. And it's that extra little bit of genetic information that changes the developmental game plan for the body and the brain.
So how does this even happen? Well, it's almost always just a random fluke. A long-term study found that in almost 96% of cases, it's because of a little hiccup when egg or sperm cells are being made. It's called chromosomal non-disjunction, which is a fancy way of saying that when the chromosomes were supposed to split apart, they didn't. One cell gets an extra copy, and that's all it takes.
And you can really see the impact of that single extra page when you look at the physical characteristics. That same study we just mentioned, they tracked this stuff. And look at this. You can see how common some features are. An upward slant to the eyes, a flatter facial profile. These were seen in more than 9 out of 10 people in the study. It's amazing how one small change can create such a consistent pattern.
All right, so we've covered what an extra page in the blueprint looks like. But what happens if the opposite occurs? What if a page is just gone? That brings us to our second error type, and a condition called Turner syndrome. The key thing to understand about Turner syndrome is that it's all about the sex chromosomes. Typically, females have 2 X chromosomes. But in what's considered the classic form of Turner syndrome, one of those is missing. There's only 1 X chromosome. That's why it's also called monosomy X. Mono, of course, meaning 1.
You know, it's not super common, affecting about 1 in every 2,500 girls. But this missing piece of the blueprint has some really specific effects. By far the most common feature is what doctors call growth failure, basically shorter stature. It can also mean challenges with ovarian development, which affects puberty and fertility, and unfortunately there's also a higher risk for some heart issues.
And this chart, wow, it really shows you what we're talking about. See the main lines? That's the typical growth range for girls. Now look at the dots. That's the growth path for a girl with Turner syndrome. You can literally see how pretty early on, her height just starts to drift away from those curves, dropping way below the 5th percentile. It's a really clear visual of that growth failure we mentioned.
Okay, buckle up, because we're about to change our perspective. Everything we've talked about so far has been about the number of chromosomes, big picture stuff, like a whole page being added or ripped out. Now, we're zooming way in. We're going from the page level down to a single misspelled word on that page.
And this is a totally different ballgame. You could look at the karyotype, the big picture, and everything would look perfect. 46 chromosomes all accounted for. But hidden inside one of those chromosomes is this tiny, tiny little typo in a single gene. And that one little mistake can stop a super important protein from doing its job.
This is where we get into a group of disorders with a really long name, sphingolipidosis. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful, but the idea behind it is actually pretty straightforward. Think of your cells as tiny little cities. And in those cities, you have a recycling crew. These are your enzymes. Now, in these disorders, that genetic typo we talked about means one of the key members of the recycling crew is either missing or just can't do their job. So what happens?
Well, the trash, in this case, certain fatty substances called lipids, just piles up and up, eventually becoming toxic and really damaging the cell.
The best way to really get a handle on this is to put two of these typos side by side. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at Krabbe disease and Gaucher disease. They're both in that same family of disorders, but the specific misspelled word is different for each one, and that leads to totally different problems.
So let's break this down. Over here with Krabbe disease, the typo messes up one particular enzyme. This leads to a buildup of stuff that attacks the protective coating around our nerves. The result? Really severe neurological problems. Now look at Gaucher disease. It's a different typo, affecting a different enzyme. Here, the gunk that builds up collects in places like the spleen and liver, making them bigger, and it can also cause serious bone pain. See that? Two incredibly specific, but different typos, two totally different stories.
So let's just take a step back and think about the journey we've just been on. We started with the big stuff, right? An entire extra chromosome in Down syndrome, a whole missing one in Turner syndrome. Then we zoomed all the way in, down to the molecular level, to see how one single misspelled word in the code for one enzyme could cause this massive toxic pileup inside our cells. It really shows you, from a single chromosome to a single enzyme, every single detail in our genetic blueprint is absolutely critical.
And that really leaves us with a huge, fascinating question, doesn't it? As we get better and better at reading this blueprint, we are truly stepping into a whole new age of medicine. Just imagine a future where we can find these typos before they even cause a problem, or maybe even correct them. How is that going to change everything we think we know about health, about disease? The possibilities, well, they're as massive and complicated as the genetic code itself. Thanks for digging into the blueprint of life with me today.